The night of July 17th, 1944 settled cold and moonless over the Norman hedgerows where Sergeant Thomas Barrett crouched beside his 25-pounder howitzer, counting seconds under his breath. 3 miles away, hidden in the darkness behind German lines, a Wehrmacht 155mm gun had just fired its first ranging shot at British positions near Caen. Barrett's hands moved with practiced urgency across his plotting board while a telephonist repeated coordinates in a steady monotone. Flash spotted, bearing 273 degrees, distance 4,800 yards, hostile battery. The calculation took 42 seconds. The counterfire order arrived 12 seconds later. Barrett's gun barked once, then twice, sending high explosive shells arcing through the black sky toward coordinates his eyes had never seen. The German gun fell silent after its third shot. It would not fire again that night. What had just unfolded in those 59 seconds represented a revolution in warfare that began not with radar or radio, but with human eyes trained to see what others missed, and minds trained to calculate death faster than the enemy could reload. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Flash ranging, the art of locating enemy artillery by observing the muzzle flash of their guns, had transformed from a desperate improvisation in the trenches of the Great War into a ruthlessly efficient science by the summer of 1944. But the story of how artillerymen learned to counterfire in under 60 seconds, how they turned fleeting bursts of light into precise map coordinates and devastating responses, was not a story of technology alone. It was a story of survival, of men who discovered that in the lethal geometry of indirect fire, the side that saw first and calculated fastest would live, while the other died. This was the mathematics of mutual destruction refined to its coldest efficiency. And it began with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. In the autumn of 1914, as the Western Front calcified into parallel lines of trenches stretching from the Channel to Switzerland, artillery officers faced a crisis that threatened to make their weapons obsolete. The advent of indirect fire, perfected in the decades before the war, had given howitzers and field guns devastating range and power. Gunners could now strike targets miles beyond what they could see, lobbing shells over hills and forests to devastate enemy positions hidden from view. But this same innovation had created an equally profound vulnerability. If you could not see the enemy could not see you. Artillery batteries sat concealed behind ridges and tree lines, firing with impunity because locating them had become nearly impossible. Visual observation from the ground was futile. Forward observers might see the impact of enemy shells, might even hear the distant thump of guns firing, but translating that into usable targeting data proved maddeningly difficult. The sound of artillery travelled slowly, bent around obstacles, echoed off terrain. By the time a shell exploded, the gun that fired it was hidden again behind smoke and distance. For the first year of the war, counter-battery fire remained primitive and ineffective. Gunners fired blindly at suspected enemy positions, wasting thousands of shells on empty fields. German artillery pounded Allied lines with near impunity. British and French guns responded in kind. The slaughter continued, but the guns themselves remained largely untouched, their crews safe behind the front lines, invisible in the landscape. Something had to change. Either armies would develop new methods of locating enemy artillery, or the stalemate would become permanent, the trenches inviolable, the war unwinnable. The solution, when it emerged, came not from generals or engineers, but from junior officers and scientists who recognized that the enemy's greatest strength, their invisibility, could be turned against them. Every time an artillery piece fired, it betrayed its presence for a fraction of a second. The muzzle flash, that brilliant bloom of burning propellant exploding from the gun's barrel, was visible for miles at night and even in daylight under the right conditions. The question was not whether the flash could be seen. The question was whether it could be measured precisely enough to matter. Captain Harold Hemming of the Canadian Artillery had been thinking about this problem since early 1916, when he was assigned to British Third Army in France. Hemming was not a scientist. He was a professional soldier, pragmatic and methodical, who had spent months observing German artillery fire from various vantage points along the front. He noticed that at night, when the darkness amplified every source of light, German gun flashes appeared as distinct points of brilliance against the black horizon. Each flash lasted perhaps 1/20th of a second, but in that instant it marked the precise location of the gun. Hemming's insight was geometric. If multiple observers at different positions along the front each noted the bearing to the same flash, those bearings could be plotted on a map. Where the bearings intersected, that was the gun. It was simple triangulation, the same principle surveyors had used for centuries. But implementing it on a battlefield where dozens or hundreds of guns fired simultaneously, where smoke and dust obscured vision, where telephone lines were constantly cut by shellfire, proved anything but simple. Hemming's British commanders were polite but sceptical. They had heard proposals for flash spotting before. The concept was sound in theory, but chaos in practice. How could observers be certain they were all watching the same gun? When multiple batteries fired salvos, the sky erupted in dozens of flashes within seconds. Even if observers managed to coordinate their sightings, how quickly could the data be collected and calculated? By the time gunners plotted the enemy battery's position and ranged their own fire, the enemy might have moved or fallen silent. The time lag between observation and counterfire seemed insurmountable. Hemming, undeterred, refined his method. He proposed establishing observation posts at carefully surveyed positions along a baseline several thousand yards wide. Each post would be equipped with precise instruments, theodolites or specially designed observation scopes, calibrated to measure bearings accurate to a single degree. Critically, all posts would be connected by telephone to a central plotting station. When a gun flashed, observers would immediately report the bearing. A trained plotter at headquarters, using a large-scale map and mechanical aids, could calculate the intersection of multiple bearings in minutes. By early 1917, Andrew McNaughton, appointed as the first dedicated counter-battery staff officer for the Canadian Corps, recognized Hemming's potential. McNaughton was a gunner with an engineer's mind, a man who understood both the brutal realities of trench warfare and the possibilities of applied science. He gave Hemming permission to organize experimental flash-spotting sections and assigned him the resources to prove the concept. Hemming's first operational flash-spotting base deployed in March 1917 as the Canadian Corps prepared for the assault on Vimy Ridge. 4 observation posts were established along a baseline nearly 6,000 yards wide, each manned by trained artillery observers equipped with theodolites. Telephone lines ran back to a central plotting station, where Hemming himself supervised the calculations. The system worked. On the nights before the Vimy assault, Hemming's observers identified German battery positions with an accuracy that astonished skeptics. Bearings from 3 or 4 posts intersected with errors measured in tens of yards rather than hundreds. McNaughton's counter-battery guns, firing on Hemming's coordinates, silenced German artillery that had dominated the battlefield for months. The enemy guns fell quiet, their crews dead or scattered, their positions obliterated by shells guided not by luck or guesswork, but by geometry and light. Word of Hemming's success spread rapidly through the Allied armies. Flash spotting, once dismissed as impractical, became an urgent priority. The British Army created dedicated flash spotting sections within their survey units. The French, who had been developing their own methods independently, accelerated their programs. By late 1917, every British corps on the Western Front maintained flash spotting bases as standard equipment. But success created its own problems. The Germans, realizing their muzzle flashes were being observed, began developing countermeasures. Engineers reformulated propellants to reduce flash intensity. Gunners were ordered to fire only at dawn or dusk, when ambient light made flashes less visible. Batteries dispersed more widely, making triangulation more difficult. Most effective of all, the Germans adopted shoot and scoot tactics, firing a few rounds and then displacing before counter-battery fire could arrive. The race between detection and concealment accelerated through 1918. British and Canadian flash spotting became more sophisticated. Observation posts used newly designed instruments that combined theodolites with chronometers, allowing observers to timestamp their sightings to the second. Plotting stations adopted mechanical calculators and standardized procedures that reduced the time from observation to reported coordinates. By the final offensives of the war, well-trained flash-spotting teams could locate a hostile battery and transmit firing data to counter-battery guns in under 10 minutes. 10 minutes. It was an astonishing improvement over the hours or days required in 1915, but it was still not fast enough. 10 minutes gave the enemy time to fire dozens of shells, to kill scores of men, to displace before the counterfire arrived. The flash spotters had proven that enemy artillery could be found. They had not yet proven it could be silenced quickly enough to matter decisively. That breakthrough would require new technology, new tactics, and another war. The Treaty of Versailles ended the fighting in November 1918, but did not end the evolution of artillery intelligence. Throughout the interwar years, the British Royal Artillery maintained its flash-spotting capability, preserving the hard-won lessons of the Western Front. Survey companies expanded into survey regiments. Equipment was updated, techniques refined, but the fundamental method remained unchanged. Observation posts watched for muzzle flashes, plotters calculated intersections, counter-battery officers decided which targets to engage. The system worked, but it remained labor-intensive and slow by the standards of modern warfare. When war came again in September 1939, the British Army deployed to France with one survey regiment assigned to each corps. These regiments contained specialized batteries for flash spotting, sound ranging, and artillery survey. Each flash spotting battery could deploy multiple troops, each troop capable of establishing a flash spotting base with 4 observation posts and a plotting center. The collapse of France in May and June 1940 gave flash-spotting teams almost no opportunity to demonstrate their value. The speed of the German advance, the chaos of retreat, the constant movement of forces made static observation posts impossible to establish. Telephone lines were cut faster than they could be laid. Survey regiments evacuated with minimal losses but little glory, their capabilities largely unused in a campaign, dominated by speed and shock. But in the deserts of North Africa, where the war stabilized into a more deliberate contest of position and maneuver, flash spotting began to prove its worth again. The wide-open terrain, the clear night skies, the relatively static front lines all favored observation. British survey regiments deployed to support 8th Army located German and Italian batteries with consistent accuracy. Counter-battery fire became a regular feature of the Desert War, though it remained reactive, responding to enemy fire rather than preempting it. The lessons from North Africa influenced preparations for the return to Europe. By 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Italy and eventually France, flash spotting had evolved significantly from its Great War origins. New instruments provided better optics and more precise bearings. Radio communications supplemented vulnerable telephone lines. Most importantly, the entire system had been streamlined. Plotting procedures were standardized, reducing the time required for calculations. Direct communication links connected flash-spotting troops to counter-battery officers, who could authorize immediate fire missions without waiting for reports to climb the chain of command. The time from flash observation to counter-fire order, which had required 10 minutes in 1918, had been cut to 5 minutes in operational conditions. 5 minutes was better, but it still was not fast enough. In 5 minutes, a well-trained German battery could fire 24 shells and begin displacement. The window of vulnerability remained too narrow. Flash-spotting teams needed to be faster, much faster. The breakthrough came not from new equipment but from organizational innovation and relentless training. By mid-1944, as British and Canadian forces fought through Normandy's bocage country, survey regiments had perfected a system that reduced response time to its absolute minimum. The key was parallel processing. Instead of waiting for all observations to arrive before beginning calculations, plotters started working the moment the first bearing came in. As additional bearings arrived, they refined the solution, narrowing the area of uncertainty until the hostile battery's position was fixed with acceptable accuracy. At the same time, counter-battery officers maintained constant communication with firing batteries, keeping guns laid on likely target areas. When coordinates arrived, the guns were already oriented, already loaded, already waiting for the order to fire. The entire system, from observation through calculation to execution, had been compressed into a continuous flow. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Sergeant Thomas Barrett's gun crew embodied this evolution. They had trained for months in England before D-Day, drilling the procedures until they became automatic. Barrett could plot a bearing on his map board in seconds. His telephonist could relay coordinates without hesitation. The gun crew could load and fire on command faster than any artillery in history. When combined with efficient flash-spotting teams whose observers had trained to recognize individual gun signatures, to distinguish between howitzers and field guns by the character of their flash, the entire system achieved a speed that would have seemed impossible just years before. 59 seconds. That was how long it took from the moment a German gun revealed itself until British shells were in the air, racing toward that position. 59 seconds was not magic. It was the product of organization, training, and doctrine refined through 5 years of war. It was also the product of accumulated wisdom from flash-spotting teams who had learned through bitter experience what worked and what didn't. The flash-spotting posts themselves were studies in calculated exposure. 4 observers spread across a baseline ranging from 4 to 6,000 yards, each positioned to provide maximum visibility across the enemy's likely gun positions. The posts were not elaborate. A sandbagged position, sometimes a foxhole reinforced with timber, occasionally a salvaged building with a clear view. What mattered was not comfort but geometry and communication. Each post held a theodolite or director, an instrument combining a telescopic sight with precision angle measuring capability. The observer would scan the horizon methodically, watching for the telltale bloom of light that marked an enemy gun firing. When he saw it, his response was immediate and mechanical. He would swing his instrument onto the bearing, read the angle from the graduated scale, and speak into his telephone handset. Flash observed, bearing 271 degrees. The words reached the plotting center within seconds. At the plotting center, a different drama unfolded with equal precision. The room, whether it sat in a farmhouse cellar or a purpose-built tent, contained a large plotting board covered with a detailed military map at 1 to 25,000 scale. The map showed every ridge, every village, every piece of terrain between the British lines and the German rear areas. 4 strings or wires, each representing one observation post, radiated from fixed points on the map. Small weights or markers called mice attached to each string. When a bearing came in, the plotter would swing that post's string to the correct angle and lock it in place. One bearing by itself meant nothing. The hostile battery lay somewhere along that line, but where? The second bearing, arriving seconds later from a different post, created an intersection, 2 lines crossing. That intersection marked a probable location, but still imperfect. The third bearing, from a third angle, created a triangle where all 3 lines met. That triangle, often just a few hundred yards across, contained the enemy gun. The mathematics were simple, but the execution demanded absolute precision. The observation posts had to be surveyed with exactness. An error of even a single degree in their known positions would translate into hundreds of yards of error in the target coordinates. The instruments had to be calibrated and maintained. The observers had to be trained to distinguish between gun flashes and other sources of light, between howitzers firing and mortars, between genuine hostile batteries and decoys. Most critically, they had to be fast. Every second of delay gave the enemy another moment of safety, another chance to fire and displace. The best flash-spotting teams, by late 1944, could complete the entire sequence from observation to reported grid coordinates in 40 to 50 seconds. The system's speed came from eliminating every unnecessary step, every bureaucratic delay, every moment of hesitation. The Germans understood they were being hunted. Wehrmacht artillery doctrine by 1944 emphasized displacement and concealment. Batteries were ordered to fire no more than 3 to 5 rounds from any position before moving. Guns were dug into revetments that masked their muzzle flash from certain angles. Propellants had been reformulated to produce less visible light, though this reduced the effectiveness of the charge and shortened range. Some batteries used flash suppressors, crude devices that channeled the propellant gases to reduce the bloom of light. None of it was enough. The British and Canadian survey regiments had become too efficient, too systematic, too ruthlessly good at their craft. A German battery commander who fired even a single ranging shot had exposed his position. The counterfire would arrive before his crew could limber the gun and leave. The mathematics of detection and destruction had shifted decisively. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter commanded a 150mm howitzer battery with 7th Army defending Normandy in July 1944. He had survived the Eastern Front, had learned the hard lessons of Soviet counter-battery fire, had trained his crews in rapid displacement. They practiced until they could unlimber, fire 3 rounds, and be moving again in under 8 minutes. 8 minutes had been sufficient in Russia, where Soviet artillery intelligence was often poor and response times slow. In Normandy, 8 minutes was an eternity. Richter's battery received orders on the night of July 19th to harass British positions near the Orne River. The coordinates arrived with strict instructions: fire quickly, displace immediately. Do not remain in position. Richter chose his firing location carefully, a reverse slope position that would mask his guns from ground observation. He positioned his 4 howitzers with 50 meters between them, enough separation that a near miss would not disable multiple guns. His crews stood ready, propellant charges prepared, shells fused. At 2200 hours, precisely on schedule, all 4 guns fired together. The synchronized salvo sent 16 shells arcing toward British lines 6,000 yards away. The howitzer's muzzle flash, even with reduced flash propellant, bloomed bright against the darkness. 4 points of light, visible for less than 1/10 of a second, marking the battery's location with geometric precision. 3,000 yards to the northwest, a flash-spotting observer from 5th Survey Regiment saw the flashes through his theodolite. His bearing call reached the plotting center before Richter's shells landed. 2 other observers, from different angles, reported seconds later. The plotter worked with mechanical speed, swinging the strings, marking the intersection. The triangle was tight, no more than 200 yards across. The coordinates were radioed immediately to the counter-battery officer attached to 2nd Canadian Corps. The CBO checked his target list, confirmed no. Friendly forces occupied that area and authorized immediate fire. The entire sequence required 47 seconds. Major Robert Dunlop commanded a battery of 5.5-inch medium guns positioned in a copse 4 miles behind British lines. His guns had been laid on suspected enemy artillery positions for hours, waiting. When the fire order arrived, it contained precise coordinates and the target description. Hostile battery, 4 guns, fire for effect. Dunlop's crews needed no ranging shots, no corrections. The survey regiment had provided theatre grid coordinates accurate to within 50 yards. The meteorological data, wind speed and air temperature and density had been calculated and transmitted that morning. The guns were already loaded with high explosive shells fused for ground burst. Dunlop gave the command. The 4 5.5-inch guns fired together, their shells climbing into the night sky on trajectories calculated to converge on a single 200-yard square of Norman farmland. Klaus Richter's crews were still reloading when the first British shells arrived. They had fired their initial salvo and were preparing the second, moving with practiced efficiency, when the distinctive whistle of incoming fire rose above the ambient noise of war. Richter recognized it immediately, the sound of medium artillery, heavier than field guns. And close. He shouted the warning, but there was no time. The first shell impacted 30 meters from his number 3 gun, the blast wave and fragments shredding the crew and overturning the howitzer. The second shell landed among his ammunition stores, detonating charges and shells in a secondary explosion that consumed his number 1 gun. The third and fourth shells, arriving within seconds, completed the destruction. Richter survived because he had positioned himself 50 meters from the nearest gun, directing fire from what he thought was a safe distance. He survived, but his battery was annihilated. 4. Guns destroyed, 11 men dead, 6 wounded. The engagement from first German shot to complete destruction had lasted 93 seconds. This was not an isolated incident. It was the new arithmetic of counter-battery warfare playing out across Normandy, across Italy, across every front where British or Canadian survey regiments deployed. The Germans called it Gegenfeuer, counterfire, and they had no effective defence. Their artillery, once feared for its precision and power, was being systematically neutralised by an enemy who could see in the dark and calculate faster than humanly possible. The psychological impact on German gunners was profound. They understood that every time they fired, they invited death. The old tactics, the careful ranging shots, the methodical adjustment of fire, all became suicidal. They adapted by firing blind, accepting lower accuracy in exchange for speed. They dispersed more widely, making flash spotting more difficult but also reducing their own concentration of fire. Some batteries stopped firing altogether, preserving their guns but abandoning their infantry to face enemy attacks without artillery support. British after-action reports from Normandy documented the effectiveness with cold statistical precision. During the first 6 weeks after D-Day, 2nd British Army's survey regiments established dozens of flash-spotting bases and located more than 800 hostile batteries. Of those 800, approximately 240 were engaged with immediate counter-battery fire. German prisoners confirmed that entire artillery regiments had been reduced to fragments, their survivors shell-shocked and demoralised. The reports made clear that flash spotting was no longer experimental or supplementary. It had become a primary method of artillery intelligence, equal to or exceeding aerial reconnaissance in reliability and vastly superior in speed. The old assumption that artillery could hide behind distance and terrain had been destroyed as surely as the guns themselves. The system worked because every element had been refined to eliminate delay. The observation posts maintained continuous watch, scanning their sectors methodically. The plotting centres operated in shifts, never closing, always ready to receive bearings. The counter-battery officers kept firing batteries on constant standby, guns laid on the most likely target zones. The communications network, a combination of telephone lines, radio links, and motorcycle couriers, provided redundancy against the inevitable disruptions of combat. When telephone lines were cut by shell fire, radio filled the gap. When radio was jammed or failed, couriers delivered written coordinates. The system absorbed damage and continued functioning because it had been designed with British thoroughness and tested under fire until every weakness had been identified and corrected. The Germans attempted their own flash spotting, though their efforts never matched British sophistication. Wehrmacht Beobachtungsabteilungen, observation battalions, included flash spotting and sound ranging sections, but they suffered from inadequate equipment, insufficient training, and most critically, overwhelming Allied artillery superiority. Even when German observers located British batteries, their counter-battery fire was often ineffective because British guns outnumbered them and could disperse more widely. A German battery might silence one British gun, only to be destroyed by fire from 3 others. The asymmetry of resources made flash spotting into a weapon that favoured the side with more guns, more shells, and more observers. The British had all 3. By autumn 1944, as Allied armies drove through France toward Germany, flash spotting had evolved one final step. The introduction of radar for mortar locating suggested new possibilities. Experimental radar sets, adapted from anti-aircraft systems, could track shells in flight and 5, calculate backwards to determine launch points. These radars could not yet handle the complex elliptical trajectories of howitzer shells, but they showed promise. More importantly, they demonstrated that the principle of rapid target acquisition could be automated, that machines might eventually replace human observers and mechanical calculators. The future of counter-battery warfare was visible, though it would not arrive in time to influence the war's outcome. For now, the combination of human observers, precise instruments, and systematic procedures remained supreme. The campaign in northwest Europe from June 1944 through May 1945 demonstrated flash ranging's decisive impact. British Second Army and Canadian First Army, supported by their survey regiments, maintained continuous counter-battery pressure on German artillery. Statistics compiled after the war showed that survey regiments in Italy and northwest Europe established 294 sound-ranging bases and 360 flash-spotting bases. These bases located 15,777 hostile batteries through sound ranging and 4,221 through flash spotting. Not all located batteries were engaged, many were beyond range or protected by terrain, but thousands were subjected to systematic counter-battery fire that destroyed guns and killed crews with methodical efficiency. The German perspective emerged from prisoner interrogations and post-war interviews. Artillery officers described a battlefield where firing their weapons had become an act of desperation. They spoke of batteries that existed on paper but had long since been destroyed. They described crews who refused orders to fire, who sabotaged their own guns rather than reveal their positions. They admitted that by early 1945, German artillery had largely ceased to function as an organized force. The Allies had not merely defeated German artillery. They had made it obsolete, had turned the act of firing a gun into a death sentence executed within minutes. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was no escape. Lieutenant Michael Pearson served as a flash-spotting observer with 4th Survey Regiment through the advance into Germany. His diary, donated to the Imperial War Museum decades later, captured the routine nature of what had once seemed impossible. February 7th, 1945. Observed hostile battery firing from woods east of Gotch. 3 rounds observed, bearings passed to plotting centre. Counter-battery fire commenced within 2 minutes. German guns fell silent. No further activity in that sector. The entry was typical, mechanical, almost boring in its precision. Pearson and his fellow observers had become so efficient at their craft that locating and destroying enemy artillery had become routine, no more remarkable than any other military task. They had forgotten, if they ever knew, how revolutionary their work truly was. The end of the war in May 1945 did not end the evolution of flash ranging, but it marked the end of an era. The techniques developed through 2 world wars, refined through millions of observations and calculations, had reached their ultimate expression. Human observers, using optical instruments and telephone communications, had achieved response times measured in seconds, accuracy measured in yards, and lethality that made artillery positions indefensible. But technology was already moving beyond them. Radar, computers, radio direction finding, all promised faster detection and more automated response. The post-war armies would adopt these technologies, would replace the flash spotting posts with electronic sensors, would automate the calculations that had required trained plotters. The system that men like Thomas Barrett and Klaus Richter had experienced would become history, preserved in technical manuals, and veterans' memories but superseded by machines. Yet the fundamental principle endured. Artillery that fires betrays its position. The side that detects faster, calculates faster, and responds faster will dominate the battlefield. Flash ranging had proven this principle with brutal clarity. The 59 seconds from flash observation to counterfire, the time that separated survival from annihilation, represented more than tactical efficiency. It represented the culmination of human ingenuity applied to the problem of mutual destruction. It demonstrated that warfare had become a contest not merely of courage or numbers, but of systems, of organizations that could process information and deliver violence faster than their enemies. In this contest, the British and Canadians had achieved superiority through relentless attention to detail, through training that made complex procedures automatic, through communications that eliminated delay, and through doctrine that placed counter-battery warfare at the center of artillery operations. The German artillery that Klaus Richter commanded in July 1944 had been among the finest in the world in 1939. Its guns were superb, its crews well-trained, its doctrine sophisticated. But doctrine and equipment meant nothing against an enemy who could see every shot fired and respond before the gun could move. Richter himself was captured 3 days after his battery's destruction, found wandering in a daze near Caen. He told his interrogators that he had believed his position was concealed, that the reverse slope would protect his guns from observation. He had not understood that concealment from ground observers meant nothing when the flash itself was the target. He had fired, and in firing, he had died. His battery had died. His war was over. The system had worked with mechanical perfection. For Sergeant Thomas Barrett and the thousands of other artillerymen who operated the flash-ranging system, the work continued until the war's final day. They deployed across France, into Belgium, across the Rhine, into Germany itself. They established their observation posts, laid their telephone lines, calibrated their instruments, and waited for the enemy to reveal himself. When the enemy fired, they observed, plotted, and called down destruction with 59 seconds of cold efficiency. They did not think of themselves as revolutionaries. They were simply doing their jobs, following procedures, executing orders. But in doing so, they had transformed warfare. They had made invisible enemies visible. They had made distance irrelevant. They had compressed the cycle of detection and destruction to its absolute minimum. They had proven that in modern war, the advantage belonged not to those who hid best, but to those who saw first and struck fastest. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.